Thank you very much, Senor Maura, for your kind and unexpected invitation, which does me great honour. Within most, because of the time, I shall sort of read the beginning and end of this paper, but I shall be abbreviating the middle bit quite substantially. Within most member states of the European Union, European citizenship is not a popular cause. Cynicism towards European institutions is all too obvious in many member states, especially in the oldest and/or richest ones. Indeed, the EU now seems to be held in highest esteem beyond its eastern border. The Ukrainian philosopher Volodymyr Yermolenko has claimed that the Europe of values is now in the east, while the Europe of rules is now in the west. This sense that the EU is a remote, unresponsive, unrepresentative, corrupt, and in decline, a haggard grandmother, as Pope Francis so ungallantly put it, is, I believe, fed by the perception that the EU does not care to seek the consent of its constituent peoples. It has repeatedly ignored the popular will in member states in order to pursue the orthodoxy of ever closer union, monetary, fiscal, and political. Decentralization has become a heresy rather than a legitimate political argument. Talk of the democratic deficit is an inadequate response to this crisis of confidence. Of course, in today's rapidly globalizing world, no medium-sized nation-state can exercise untrammeled sovereignty. It makes sense for countries to come together in matters which cannot be dealt with satisfactorily at national or at local level. But as Václav Havel put it, speaking to this Parliament 5 years ago, agreement to the principle of multi-layered sovereignty is only possible thanks to civic and political identification with it. Inhabitants of the member states of the EU cannot be expected to feel, still less act on, a sense of European citizenship, unless they feel that the content of European citizenship has drawn on the civic heritage of their own national, regional, or local communities. In every corner of Europe, we can find civic traditions reaching back centuries or even millennia. Europeans have practiced and developed ideas of government by consent, liberty, individual and shared rights and duties, all founded on the values of the res publica, the common good. But most of this heritage is lamentably little known. Wider appreciation of these diverse riches requires EU institutions and budget holders to promote the heritage of all parts of the European continent in the face of widespread ignorance and prejudice. This is not just a matter of national bias in school textbooks. Perfectly understandable that French children are taught about the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, that Italians learn of the glories of the Renaissance and Spaniards of the Golden Age, that Greek schools celebrate ancient Athenian democracy, that Scots know of the Declaration of Arbroath, and that at one time the English were taught about Magna Carta. Far more corrosive of European solidarity is the conviction that Eastern Europeans knew little or nothing of civic values until they were accepted into Europe. How many outside Hungary have heard of the Golden Bull? It was issued in 1222, just 7 years after Magna Carta, and well before Magna Carta was accepted into English law. The Golden Bull brought safeguards against arbitrary arrest, taxation, and military service, as well as the right of resistance. Without doubt, still fewer Europeans have heard of Philip Orlik's constitution of 1710. It was drawn up by exiled Ukrainian Cossacks and can claim to be the first such constitutional document in European history. This problem is not new, although in a long-term historical perspective, it is comparatively recent. For the last 2 or 3 centuries, much of Central and Eastern Europe was usually ruled by powers which, for the most part, sought to suppress most manifestations and even memories of the civic spirit. Fortunately, they failed. The EU should actively confront the prejudice that liberty, democracy, and civil society are Western exports to the backward eastern reaches of the continent following the fall of communism. The civic tradition I would like to enlarge on today is the republicanism of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I expect that for most of you it will be unfamiliar. This remarkable civic culture took shape in the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, flourished for almost 100 years, experienced a profound crisis, but was renewed before the Commonwealth was finally destroyed by its neighbours in 1795. The transformations that took place in the late 18th century made it possible for stateless Poles to export a universal idea of liberty to 19th century revolutionaries of Europe and the Americas, encapsulated by the slogan, "For our freedom and yours." Achievements such as the Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791 made it much harder for the propagandists of the 3 absolute monarchies that dismembered the Commonwealth to persuade European opinion that Polish liberty had been nothing more than the ruinous privileges of an anarchic, oppressive, and parasitical nobility, which had reduced its elective kings to impotence, and that Lordra ren a Varsovie, as the Russian general Ivan Pashkievich announced after suppressing the Polish-Lithuanian Rising of 1830 to 31. Now, of course, these stereotypes retain currency. They are for a variety of reasons, including the way in which Lithuanian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian national narratives were constructed. And I would not like to deny or brush over the many faults and weaknesses of the Commonwealth. Yes, the great majority of the population were excluded from citizenship, but then were there no slaves in ancient Athens? The idea, the tradition retains its currency, despite the imperfections with which the idea was implemented. The Commonwealth should not be written off as a failure. The civic republican values which shaped, sustained, and revived it can provide some excellent examples for Europe today, as well as a warning of how things can go wrong. The first point to make is the sheer size of the Commonwealth. Up there in the early 17th century, you can see it encompasses all of modern Belarus, Lithuania, and Latvia, most of Poland and Ukraine, half of Estonia, and parts of Russia. And this size was the principal source of its diversity. The great continental confessional divide between Western and Eastern Christendom bisected the Commonwealth. Catholics and Orthodox Christians simply had to find a way of working things out, even before the complications brought by the Protestant Reformation. Religious toleration was a necessary condition for the settlement over many centuries of successive waves of migrants, including Ashkenazi Jews, Tatars, Karaites, Dutch Mennonites, Scots, Bohemian Brethren, Armenians, Russian Old Believers, and, until the mid-18th century, anti-Trinitarians. Toleration did not mean equality, except in one case, which I'll come to in a minute. But it did mean that disputes were usually settled peacefully and according to civil law. Among the nobility, for a few decades at least, equality between Christian confessions did prevail. This is the founding document of what is called the Confederation of Warsaw. It was agreed a year after the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France. The nobility, faced with an interregnum, they had to elect a new king, prevent a civil war, defend the frontiers. They resolved that between themselves, those who differed in religion would not persecute each other, would not shed blood, would not confiscate property on account of those differences. This was an agreement made between equal citizens rather than the toleration, the suffering of a dissident minority. That was what came later. But for several decades at least, equality prevailed. The political system which crystallized in the third quarter of the 16th century was a republican political culture. It recognized that the common good, the res publica, had to be achieved by compromise, negotiation, discussion. Given the diversity of interests in the state, given the lack of coercive power, implementation required the cooperation and involvement of local citizens. Simple majority voting might have broken the Commonwealth beyond repair. This is the origin of what became an illness, the requirement of unanimity, the liberum veto. But in its origins, the requirement of consensus derived from the conviction that votes should be weighed rather than counted. The validity of the arguments and the authority of the speaker were more important than sheer numbers. The liberum veto was also an outgrowth of the libera vox. The right to free speech in public matters was guaranteed by law in 1609, although it had been practiced for much longer. It came to comprehend the freedom of the press. Now, free speech and free writing was not just an individual right. It was a civic duty, the duty of the citizen to give counsel regarding the Commonwealth. This exemplifies both the individual and the collective dimensions of freedom. The two form a symbiosis. The rights, privileges, liberties which came to be collectively regarded as liberty can be derived from, I think, two main sources. One was the steady concession of particular liberties and privileges from kings in the late Middle Ages and in the 16th century. They included exemption from taxation without consent. They included the principle of no incarceration without trial. And in 1505, perhaps the most important of these individual liberties, the law of nihil novi. Nothing new might be established by law without the consent of the lower house of Parliament, the representatives of the various lands and provinces. And in the course of the 16th century, these liberties came to be shared by Lithuanian and Ruthenian nobles. Now, this is not actually particularly unusual in late medieval and early modern Europe. Elective monarchies were common. Simple majority voting in Parliament was rare. But in the course of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, this process went into reverse in many places. Monarchs claimed and exercised a greater degree of power than hitherto. The rise of the so-called absolute state was long regarded by historians as the necessary vehicle of modernization, especially in its 18th century variant of enlightened absolutism. In the French case, it supposedly prepared the way for the progressive, centralizing, modernizing state of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire. Nowadays, historians tend to emphasize the importance of assuring consent in localities. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, which was long derided as an obstacle to a modern German nation state, has undergone something of a rehabilitation as a framework of law and collective security. So this is one side of things. The other is that by the time the drift towards so-called absolutism began, an alternative republican ideology had been excavated, the favourite metaphor of Quentin Skinner, from the surviving writings of classical antiquity, and applied to these collections of liberties and practices of self-government. Now, one of the very best cases of early modern republicanism, at least as applicable to the theories explained by Skinner and others, was in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And essentially, Skinner has questioned the liberal tendency to contrast collective and individual freedom. Call the former ancient, positive and republican, and the latter modern, negative or liberal. Now, the former idea is often associated by liberals with the tyranny of the majority. The latter is often invoked to justify restrictions placed on popular democracy. Now, the conviction excavated by Skinner and others is that all individual freedoms from the actions of an arbitrary ruler depend and are secured by the participation by free citizens in the making and execution of laws. So negative individual freedom is not an alternative to positive collective freedom to participate in government. Instead, it depends upon it. And such was the conviction of Polish-Lithuanian republicans steeped in the Latin classics. This was the foundation for a mixed form of government, according to the Aristotelian formula: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. But more ambitiously, this had to be practiced not in a small city-state, but in a vast area which at its zenith covered more than 1 million square kilometres. It not only necessitated compromise between interests, but it necessitated the implementation of laws by local communities. Jean-Jacques Rousseau at the end of the 18th century tried to square this circle. His answer was more decentralisation, not less. So could the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth teach the European Union a lesson in subsidiarity? Now, if this is going to work well, much will be demanded. It requires deep reservoirs of civic virtue, the willingness to make sacrifices to the common good. It rests on much trust between monarch and citizens, and between wealthier and poorer citizens. Nowadays, we may well ask, when there seems to be precious little sacrificial virtue and trust in some of the most stable and coherent local and national communities within Europe, with identities that have been nurtured over many centuries, what hope could there possibly be for such qualities among European citizens? And the idea of inculcating patriotic virtues through education has been tainted by the fear of indoctrination in national hatred. Surely it would be easier to rule Europeans technocratically, guaranteeing their individual human rights through a learned and competent, but not accountable, judiciary. No, indeed no. And not only because peoples whose clear wish is repeatedly ignored by their governors will in the end revolt against the entire system. The genie of popular sovereignty has long since left the bottle. As Professor Geremik used to say, the only answer to the problems of democracy is more democracy and better democracy. There is an old Republican axiom: the freedom of each and all cannot be safe without the participation of each and all. Now, there's an endless argument about how republics decline and fall. Suffice it to say that in the mid-18th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Republic, after a long decline, began to revive, and it was associated with three things. First, a renewed emphasis in education, much of it conducted by religious orders, on the need for the civic virtues of respectful and reasoned persuasion. The second was that robust institutions must be made not for angels, but for sinful, but redeemable men. And the third was a willingness to study and learn from the experience of other countries, and to apply those lessons discriminately without abandoning the Commonwealth's own traditions. The problem was that the Commonwealth was increasingly dependent on the Russian Empire, but even so, it still managed to pass the Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791, the outcome of compromise, a blend of the republican sovereignty of the nation with the Montesquieuian division of powers into legislative, executive, and judicial. A balance between the individual rights of citizens and their collective...
Yes, sorry, you have to finish.
And the need to defend independence. Before Russia was able to destroy the Commonwealth, the idea of the Polish nation was widened. Instead of just a nobility of perhaps 7.5% of the population, still larger than some 19th century franchises, it extended that citizenship to burghers, and at least in theory made peasants of all religions and all languages part of the nation. Jews as well, at least in theory. As this universal idea, this could be exported during the 19th century. The banner is carried in insurrections and revolutions across Europe from the Spring of Nations to the Second World War and beyond. In 1956, Hungarian students marched to the statue of General Józef Bem in order to show their solidarity with Poles menaced by the Soviet Union. He had led the Hungarian army in the 1848 War of Independence. Unfortunately, as Geremik observed in 2008, this history of struggle for liberty, symbolized by the Hungarian 1956, the Prague Spring and Solidarność, is not part of European collective memory. And nor is that other triumph of civil society, the human chain formed by Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians on the 23rd of August 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. The Iron Curtain has thankfully gone from Europe, but the threat to freedom from an arbitrary and illiberal neo-imperial regime has not. The problem posed by yesterday's conference here in the European Parliament, Ukraine as a test for European solidarity, has no easy answers. But the history of the region can teach us some lessons. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth ultimately failed the Cossacks of Ukraine. It failed them because it denied their wish to participate as fellow citizens in a republican political system. The Cossacks were driven into the arms of Muscovy, where they remained for 3.5 centuries. When the Commonwealth succeeded, it did so by tolerating convictions which many found heretical or idolatrous. It did so by reaching decisions by reasoned argument, consensus, and compromise. It did so by decentralizing functions of government to the localities, and it did so by involving its citizens in the making and execution of laws. These, ladies and gentlemen, are just some of the many underexplored treasures of the shared European heritage of liberty. And, I would argue, the cause of European citizenship needs them all. Thank you.